The French colonies in the New World are often mentioned and known about, but not really understood, despite French influence still persisting to the modern day. To many in America, the French were strictly the historical antagonist against the early settlers. Maybe some may recall them as George Washington's first enemy, or their spectacular defeat at the Plains of Abraham outside of Quebec, which led to the settlement by the British of Canada. Even the lower portion of New France, Louisiana, the sale of which for a relative pittance remains a point to mock Napoleonic France. That aside, the French, where they decided to settle, persist and can still be met today. The French, like the rest of Europe after the fall of Constantinople, were interested in finding an alternate route to China. Even after Christopher Columbus had been to the New World and back a few times, the idea that going west to China was just a matter of finding a way past the islands that turned out to be a whole continent persisted. The thing is, the monarchs of Europe had much more pressing issues to attend to. Even Columbus's first expedition was an example of right place, right time. Had Columbus's crew been less patient and mutinied before reaching the Bahamas, the expedition would have returned to Spain a failure, or been lost at sea. The French were interested in a western route, and by 1508 the merchants of France had convinced King Louis XII to send a scouting expedition west. This took place in the short window between a war to conquer Naples and the joint Vatican and Venetian response to curb Louis's Italian ambitions. The expedition was captained by Thomas Albert and departed the Norman port of Dieppe. The expedition employed a Florentine navigator, Giovanni de Verrazzano. This would be his first expedition to the New World. Albert's expedition had followed in the footsteps of earlier Norman and Basque fishermen seeking cod off the Grand Banks. But this expedition returned with a different cargo. In 1509, the expedition had returned to Dieppe with 7 Native Americans, their clothes, weapons, and a canoe. It wouldn't be well until the reign of the next king, Francis I, that New World exploration would be taken more seriously. In response to the return of the Magellan expedition, the merchants of France advised King Francis to redouble his father's efforts, lest France fall behind the Spanish and Portuguese. In 1523, Verrazzano was invited to command 4 ships and set sail with the intention of searching for the passage to the Pacific. 2 of the 4 ships were lost during a storm. The survivors, La Dauphine and La Normandie, were forced to return to port for repairs before departing again in the final days of 1523. The second part of the expedition took a calmer, more southerly route through Spanish and Portuguese-controlled waters, arriving off the coast of North America at Cape Fear in modern-day North Carolina. After a short stay, the expedition headed north, noting Pimlico Sound, the Chesapeake Bay, and the Hudson River as potential candidates for the fabled Northwest Passage. Verrazzano arranged a second private expedition to Brazil with investors seeking Brazilwood. His third expedition ended in failure, and conflicting accounts blame either cannibals or the Spanish. In 1534, King Francis formally commissioned well-known sailor Jacques Cartier to continue Verrazzano's work. Cartier's first expedition was to the Gulf of St. Lawrence, planting a cross on the shores of Gaspé Bay, claiming the land for France, and kidnapping the local Iroquois chief Donnacana's children before returning to France. Cartier returned to the St. Lawrence the next year, returning his 2 captives. The expedition sailed up the St. Lawrence, visiting the Iroquois village of Stadacona, before continuing upriver to the larger and more fortified village of Hochelaga, finally encountering the Lachine Rapids. Cartier believed that the rapids were all that separated him from the Pacific, and his men wintered at Stadacona. Despite the harsh Canadian winter and a scurvy problem the natives had to save them from, Cartier and his expedition returned to France, this time taking Chief Donnacana with them. It took until 1540 before a full expedition could be arranged. This time Cartier was finished with the idea of a Northwest Passage and sought another myth, the fabulously wealthy kingdom of Saguenay. This kingdom did not exist, and may have been a misinterpretation of legends combined with the knowledge of the recently conquered Aztec Empire, skewing the French understanding of Native American development. Regardless, the expedition set sail in May of 1541 and entered the St. Lawrence, receiving an icy welcome from the villagers of Stadacona, prompting the expedition to make landfall further up at Cap Rouge, where they constructed Fort Charlesbourg Royal. Unable to discover the fabled kingdom of Saguenay, Cartier returned to France in 1542 with ships full of what he believed to be gold and diamonds. They were pyrite and quartz crystals. After a hard winter, attacks from Stadacona, and the deaths of 35 of Cartier's men, the colony was abandoned in September of 1543. Aside from a failed trading post on Sable Island, this attempt would mark the end of French settlement in Canada until the beginning of the next century. Under the reign of King Henry IV, spurred on by growing English and Dutch interest in the New World, France sponsored Pierre de Gouin, Sieur de Mont, and Samuel de Champlain to set up a permanent colony and assert their dominance in North America. De Gouin was a nobleman who fought for Henry during the French Wars of Religion, a series of Protestant Catholic civil wars. For his service, De Gouin was given a pension and governorship of Pont in the southwest of France. De Gouin was accompanied by Norman-born naval captain Pierre de Chauvin to the New World for the first time in 1599. Chauvin was granted a New World fur duopoly with Francois Grave du Pont for their service to the king in the aforementioned civil wars. Chauvin led his expedition to Tadoussac, where the Saguenay River flows into the St. Lawrence, a well-known meeting point for European fishermen and native Innu people to engage in trade. After a disastrous attempt to colonize St. Croix Island in Maine, the French returned to the St. Lawrence. The first winter killed all but 5 of the 15 men left behind at Tadoussac. In 1603, Samuel de Champlain accompanied Grave on a fur trading expedition, the group landing at Tadoussac in March, doing the same the next year. Champlain was an admirer of Jacques Cartier and sought to see all the things Cartier sought, and go even further into the boundless continent. Champlain searched south of the Bay of Fundy, enduring a hard winter on St. Croix Island. In the spring, Champlain sailed across the bay, founding Port Royal on what is now Nova Scotia. Using Port Royal as a base, Champlain traveled to Cape Cod, where he received a violent welcome from the Nassauet Algonquins, and the French were driven back north. Soon after this, Hendrik Lonck, the first Dutch captain in the New World, working for the Dutch East India Company, boarded De Gouin and Champlain's ships, plundering their furs and ammunition, forcing the expedition to return to France. De Gouin had to remain in France to defend his monopoly, but sent Champlain with 3 ships of workers to fulfill their quest from Henry to establish a permanent settlement. This time Champlain had decided on a spot. Champlain, commanding the Don de Dieu, God's gift, landed at Tadoussac, where the expedition disembarked and took small boats further upriver. The expedition landed at the former village of Stadacona, by now long abandoned due to increased hostility from other Iroquois and disease. Champlain and his men constructed a fortification called the Habitation de Quebec, Quebec referring to the cliffside narrows on which the city sits. With Quebec established, King Henry gave the habitation a city charter and declared it the capital of New France. A few days after landing in Quebec, Champlain faced a plot to kill him by Jean Duval, who sought to secure the settlement for the Basques and sell the colony to Spain. The plot ended quickly with one of Duval's co-conspirators spilling the beans to the pilot of the Don de Dieu, who promptly told Champlain. Champlain lured Duval and his collaborators with 2 bottles of wine aboard the Don de Dieu, where the 4 were promptly arrested. Duval was summarily executed in Quebec, Champlain adorning his most prominent palisade with Duval's severed head. The rest were sent back to France. Quickly, Champlain set about making alliances with the enemies of his enemy, the Mohawk. In this era, the Mohawk were the most easterly of the Haudenosaunee, better known in English as the Iroquois League. The Mohawk in 1609 were based primarily in the Mohawk River Valley, so named for the tribe, but claimed territory as far south as New Jersey, east to Vermont, and north to the St. Lawrence River. It's suspected by archaeologists that the Mohawks defeated the non-Haudenosaunee St. Lawrence Iroquois that Jacques Cartier had met on his first few expeditions, conquering the St. Lawrence as their hunting ground. Champlain secured alliances with the Iroquoian-speaking Huron, the Algonquins of the Ottawa River, and longtime trading partners, the Innu. The Huron, despite speaking an Iroquoian language, like the St. Lawrence Iroquois, were no friends to the Mohawk, and urged Champlain to lead these allies in a preemptive strike on the Mohawk. Champlain led a 300-man scouting mission in the vicinity of Lake Champlain. This war party had not encountered any Mohawks. By late July, all but 60 or so men remained in the field, when on July 29th, Champlain's party encountered a 250-strong band of Haudenosaunee. Champlain claims to have sniped 2 of the 3 war chiefs with 1 shot of his arquebus. And really, who am I to doubt this feat? Regardless, with the chiefs killed, the Haudenosaunee fled the field. The next year, with better information and a route under their belt, the French allies once more marched into Mohawk territory. This time, the 300 French allies caught a little over 100 Mohawks in a fortification near present-day Sorel-Tracy, Quebec. Champlain claims 100 Mohawks slain and 15 captured. This defeat settled hostilities between the French and the Mohawks for 20 years, at the cost of embittering the Haudenosaunee towards the French, who would remain their avowed enemy for the better part of a century. The Mohawks, too, would use the principle of my enemy is my friend, and were ready trading partners with the Dutch. The next time the Mohawks would threaten New France, they would do so with firearms. In the meantime, things were looking up for the French in their new territory. With the Mohawks dealt with, the French solidified their alliances and began expanding their fur trading operations. To this end, Champlain enlisted young Frenchmen to come to the New World. These young men would live with the allied tribes and learn their ways, becoming the first coureurs de bois, or runners of the woods. These coureurs de bois were originally just fur traders, but, having learned the ways of the natives, became scouts, diplomats, hunters, trappers, and among the best frontiersmen on the continent. These coureurs de bois, having lived with and in many cases been accepted by native nations as one of their own, began marrying native women, affairs that were à la façon du pays, according to the custom of the country. The factors for this are obvious. Most humans alive today have twice as many female ancestors as male ancestors. Before the advent of real medical science, people died like flies, even under the best circumstances. These Frenchmen, often having access to money and supplies, were an attractive choice for native women, especially if disease had wiped out half or more of a tribe. Marriage to a native woman would also be advantageous to the fur trade. Native women were crucial to furthering relations with other tribes and could fill in gaps in a coureur de bois' local knowledge, especially if the man wasn't raised in New France or around natives. The results of these unions were called métis, or mixed, among other things, and were, as you could imagine, received and accepted by Quebecois and native society to varying degrees. These marriages were also a symptom of supply and demand. Champlain had trouble getting French men to the colony. French women were a completely different story. New France's small population size ultimately would be its undoing. In 1627, French cardinal and statesman Armand Jean Duplessis, 1st Duke of Richelieu, or simply Cardinal Richelieu, dissatisfied with the continued failure of the previously granted New France fur monopolies, urged King Louis XIII to form the Company of 100 Associates, or the New France Company. The New France Company was a chartered company, a corporation with investors, and a royal charter. The New France Company was the second of such organizations in French history. The company had 100 investors, as the name implies, of whom Champlain was one. To be an investor required a buy-in of 3,000 French livres. With the investment secured, Richelieu sought to turn New France into a functioning French domain. To this end, Richelieu appointed Champlain to be governor of the colony. The cardinal further wished to secure the colony for the Pope, inviting Franciscan and Jesuit missionaries to the colony in addition to forbidding non-Catholics from living in New France. This move forced many of the initial settlers, a decent number Protestant, to leave for the pro-Protestant English colonies to the south. The New France Company didn't own New France. The sole owner of land was the king. The company sold land on behalf of the king to large landholders, in a system rooted in manorialism. The land was parceled into ribbons to be sold to tenant farmers, not unlike what was going on elsewhere in European-controlled America. In New France, this was called the seigneurial system, and was enforced rigidly, with laws designed to prevent as much land as possible from falling into the hands of the colonists. In this system, a landlord was obliged to provide certain things for the common use of his tenants. The most important for tenant and lord alike was a grist mill. For every 14 sacks of flour milled, the lord was entitled to 1 sack, a significant source of income in an era of wildly varying food prices. Though the Canadians were free to do what they wanted with their ribbon, so long as they could pay the landlord had supremacy over fish, lumber, and common grazing land. These ribbons were so laid out to better facilitate access to transportation, namely rivers, but later this system would also account for roads. By the late 1620s, the situation in New France had taken a turn. The Beaver Wars were in full swing, with Dutch allied Mohawks driving the Algonquin Mohicans from the region around Lake George and the upper Hudson River, monopolizing the region's furs. This, in addition to English privateers that had previously traded with the colony, raising Tadoussac and Cap Tourmente before capturing Quebec in 1628. The city was held by David Kirke until cessation of hostilities in 1632, when it was returned to the French. The majority of the 100 colonists in New France had fled back to France upon the capture of the colony, and returned in 1632. Champlain, now in his late 60s, too returned next year, this time not as governor, but as lieutenant governor, nominally under Richelieu, but acted and was treated by the people as governor. Champlain, in his last act as leader of New France, invaded the Haudenosaunee, seeking to drive them off for good. Champlain died of a stroke in 1635, and was succeeded by Charles Jacques Halt de Montmagny, who continued hostilities with the Haudenosaunee. Competition for furs only got fiercer as the traditional hunting grounds of the Haudenosaunee were depleted. In 1638, the Confederacy expanded west, conquering the Wenroe Iroquois in western New York. The Wenroe that survived fled north across Lake Ontario, taking refuge with the Huron. This put the Haudenosaunee in a tenuous position with New France, as they couldn't defeat the neutral Iroquoian Confederacy, a competing confederacy allied with the powerful Erie Confederacy to the west, so set their eyes north on New France, no doubt with some persuasion by the Dutch. In 1641, a Mohawk envoy met with Montmagny in Trois-Rivières to discuss peace. The Mohawks wanted the French to abandon their allies. In exchange, the French would be allowed to set up trading posts in Haudenosaunee lands. Montmagny rejected the offer, mistrustful of the Dutch-allied Haudenosaunee, who New France had fought ceaselessly since the first days of the colony. Over the following years, Haudenosaunee attacks on the Huron accelerated. In 1645, the Haudenosaunee brought the French back to the negotiating table. What followed seemed to the Iroquois to be a victory. In exchange for the end of open hostilities, the Iroquois would begin trading with the French. Only after 60 canoes loaded with furs made it all the way to Quebec did the French demand the Iroquois use the Huron as middlemen. This insulted the Confederacy, and the war resumed. The balance of power shifted permanently for the French when their Huron allies were overrun by a numerically inferior force armed with Dutch firearms. This was made possible by the French policy towards giving guns to the natives. They required any natives to convert to Christianity before they were allowed firearms, not to mention the sort of end-user costs associated with the early firearms. This was in stark contrast to the Dutch policy, which starting in 1648 began direct wholesale of firearms and their associated necessities to the Haudenosaunee. This defeat scattered the Huron and was only halted temporarily by the Ottawa. Those that weren't killed joined the Haudenosaunee or fled to the Petun of Lake Huron's Georgian Bay, forming the Wyandot people. The defeats continued. In 1650, the Haudenosaunee invaded the Neutral Confederacy, leveraging again their superior number of firearms to consume the Neutrals. Those that weren't killed were too assimilated or driven west. The Erie Confederacy were numerically superior and refused to be displaced. The war was long and costly for the Haudenosaunee, who took until 1655 to destroy the Erie. The French had lost most of their best allies in the west, and thus infrequent but devastating raids began on the colony and their remaining eastern Abenaki allies. In 1660, 17 Canadian and Algonquin militia, led by Adam Dollard d'Ormeau, the 24-year-old garrison commander of Ville Marie, now Montreal, traveled 40 miles up the Ottawa River. Dollard's intention was to meet a Haudenosaunee warband that had been reported and prevent them from assaulting the colony. The group had begun fortifying an old Algonquin fort near what is today St. Andre, Quebec, and were joined by 44 Huron warriors. An initial force of some 200 Haudenosaunee warriors and their Huron slaves caught the defenders before the palisades were complete, but the French, making good use of ambush tactics, drove off the initial scouting canoes before falling back to the fort. The Haudenosaunee began constructing their own fort in preparation for a siege, while simultaneously attacking the French position. The French drove off 2 attacks, the first of which saw the French canoes burnt, but the second saw the Seneca war chief killed. In a brazen act, the French sallied out to the fallen chief to retrieve his head, which was prominently placed on the palisades. After their third attack was repulsed, the Haudenosaunee sent for reinforcements. 500 more warriors joined the battle, and after 5 days the defenders could fight no longer. In the face of mantelets, large log shields more than capable of stopping a musket, the French defenders ignited their powder, destroying the fort as the Haudenosaunee warriors overcame the defenses. The defenders were wiped out, trading their lives to blunt the Haudenosaunee spear, who suffered heavy casualties in what I would call a Pyrrhic victory. The remaining warband had to retreat back into friendly territory and did not assault New France as Dollard had feared. Regardless of Dollard's true intentions, of which historians argue, the Battle of Long Sault had the same effect on New France as the Alamo would for Texas. This incident is also important as it highlighted the insecurity of the colony, and the subsequent reaction led the Crown to take a more active role in stewarding New France.